My guest tonight, John Perkins' first book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, was a groundbreaking story about corporate greed in America, its destructive global influence on developing third world countries, and the role he himself played in that destruction. The book spent nearly a year on the New York Times bestseller list and went on to become one of the most critically acclaimed nonfiction books of the year. Perkins goes into even more depth in this book, The Secret History of the American Empire, about the Machiavellian manipulation of the global economy by what he calls the corporatocracy of America and what we as responsible citizens can do to help put a stop to it. In his other book, Hoodwinked, he pulls back the curtain on the real cause of the current global financial meltdown. He shows how we've been hoodwinked by the CEOs who run the corporatocracy, those few corporations that control the vast amounts of capital, land, and resources around the globe, and the politicians they manipulate. These corporate fat cats, John explains, have sold us all on what he calls predatory capitalism. And tonight we're going to be talking to him. We're taking calls. We are live. If you have topic-specific questions, we would be happy to take your phone call. John, thanks so much for joining me on the air. Welcome.
Thanks, Hillary. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, I have a lot of questions for you tonight, and I've been following your work for a very long time, and I really love the fact that you were able to pull yourself out of this web of sticky places. That's kind of how I see it, and move into a world of shamanic, higher spiritual learning, and I'm looking forward to sharing that message with my listeners tonight. But before we get into that, John, my question for you tonight, I'd like to start with what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico, and maybe get your intake on that at some point throughout the hour. So just kind of set that on a shelf, and maybe you can help us understand better what's going on according to the places that you've been involved in. So what exactly is an economic hitman, John?
Well, Hillary, I think it's fair to say that we, economic hitmen, have created the world's first truly global empire, primarily without the military for the first time in history, but through economics. And although we have many different approaches to doing this, I think the most common one would be to identify countries with resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange huge loans to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. Yet the money doesn't go to the country. It instead goes to our own corporations that build power plants and highways, industrial parks, big infrastructure projects that, of course, bring in a lot of money to those corporations and help a few wealthy families in those countries, but do not help the majority of the people who are too poor to benefit from them. And yet those people, the citizens of the country, are left holding a debt they can't possibly repay. So we go back to the country at some point and say, since you can't repay your debts, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies or whatever the resource is without any environmental restrictions. Vote with us in the United Nations, allow us to build military base on your land, really be part of our empire. And when the few cases when we fail, and I talk in my books about how I failed with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and the Panamanian president, Omar Torrijos, I wasn't able to corrupt them. I wasn't able to get them to accept these deals, to play the game. They were both assassinated by people we call jackals, and these are men or women who either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. They step in on the few instances when we economic hitmen fail.
So is this like a secret government operation, or is it really the big corporations have become so large and have gained so much power that they're able to act like, private governments and going in and exploiting these people?
It's, the big corporations run the government. It's not the other way around, unfortunately, I think. Well, maybe, I don't know what it's unfortunate about, but it's just the way things are. And that's changed in my lifetime, really. It used to be when we looked at the world as this globe with roughly 200 countries, a few of those countries had a lot of power, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States. But today we'd better envision the globe, still roughly 200 countries, but these huge clouds drifting around it. And these are the big corporations. They don't know any national boundaries. They don't listen to any specific sets of laws. They strike deals with whatever country satisfies them and whatever one has the resources or markets they're interested in exploiting. They're really calling the shots. They own the mainstream media, and they own most of the politicians one way or another around the world. They really are the new power. We're at a time in history, Hillary, that's kind of like when city-states became nations. Except this time, the nations are becoming irrelevant. It's the big corporations that are ruling.
Mm-hmm. And John, how did you yourself get involved into this kind of work? How were you seduced into it?
Well, I was recruited by the National Security Agency when I was still in business school in Boston in the late 60s. Went through a whole series of tests, personality tests, lie detector tests, and they identified me as a guy that would make a good economic hitman. I was a good con man, they thought, and with credentials, having gone to business school. And they also identified several weaknesses that would make it easy to hook me. And I talk in detail in the books about these, but I think I can summarize them by saying I think they're the three big drugs of our culture: sex, power, and money. And I was a very young man. I was infected with all of those drugs. I wanted sex, I wanted power, I wanted money, and this job offered all of them.
So you were literally seduced into this world. Now, do they actively search out people in these kinds of schools, the better schools? How do they find people like you to do these jobs? Are they always watching, so to speak?
Well, I can't really answer that question because I don't know what their policy is. But in my particular case, I was married to a woman whose father was very high up in the Navy Department. I was trying to avoid Vietnam, and this is back in the late 60s. My father-in-law's best friend was very high up in the National Security Agency, which had the potential of being draft deferrable. So he arranged for me to go in for interviews, and once I'm in there and I'm going through the lie detector test and the personality test, and at that point they identified me as being ideal for this kind of a job. Somebody else they might have identified as being the perfect guy to be the spy behind the scenes in North Korea. I don't know, but for me, this is the personality that they saw in me.
Mm-hmm. So some people would say, there's a lot of talk out there on the internet and so on and so forth about a new world order, that this is a conspiracy, that, the Illuminati is running the world, and, it's a small collective group of people. Would you agree with that statement, or do you have other thoughts about that?
I have no proof of that at all, and no reason to believe that. I don't suppose I have any real reason not to believe it. I've certainly never been at those levels or seen anything like that. What I see instead is a fairly small group of corporate executives, what I call the corporatocracy, the men primarily, a few women, who run our biggest multinational corporations, all being driven by one goal, one common goal, and that is to maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. Simply put, maximize profits. And they don't have to get together and conspire to do anything illegal. A lot of them don't even know each other, but they're all headed for that same goal. So while you may have Exxon and Chevron competing for your dollar at the gas pump, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to new regulations, for example, new regulations that are going to be imposed as a result of the terrible accident in the Gulf, these companies are all going to come together and fight as one family in Congress, not to have more restrictions, or at least to minimize that. And you'll say the same thing about Nike and Reebok and Adidas and those companies. When push comes to shove, they come together, and then they compete in the market. This doesn't imply that there's a conspiracy, but there certainly is the common shared goal, and they all recognize that and fight very hard to preserve that goal. And, in addition to maximizing profits regardless of social and environmental costs, the other part of that is something Milton Friedman and what I call predatory capitalism fought very hard for, and that is to constantly reduce regulations. Business does not want to be regulated, so they all fight hard to not be regulated.
To maximize their profits.
Maximize the profits, avoid regulation, and privatize everything. Convince the government that private businesses should run basically everything, including now the military in Afghanistan.
Okay, so John, let me ask you this now. What in your opinion is going on in the Gulf? What's happening? Is this just a matter of total lack of respect for the environment and maximizing profits, and that it's just that cut and dry?
Well, it tells you the power of oil companies, and we have to remember that the oil companies are by no means alone. The banking industry, the insurance industry, the health industry, the engineering industry, and all the peripheral industries that revolve around all those that I just named are all highly dependent on oil. And they step to the plate to defend oil if they have to, because they realize how important oil is to them, not to mention the transportation sector, the utility sector, so many sectors that are dependent on oil. So you can see right here the power base that a company like BP has and all the oil companies. And I think it's important for us to understand that this well, this leak that's going on right now, could conceivably never be stopped. I don't think that's likely, but we have to face the possibility that such a catastrophe could happen. It could destroy the oceans. And if it destroys the oceans, it could destroy life as we know it on Earth. There's one well. There's a possibility. So while we're all worried about Iran having nuclear weapons and what's North Korea doing, et cetera, we ought to be a lot more concerned about what these big corporations are doing. And it's an accident, theoretically, but obviously some very poor decisions were made that were all based on greed, that were based on this idea of maximizing profits. And we really, really need to look at that and the danger to our planet. I think the other thing we should be looking at, Hillary, is understanding that actually Texaco, which is now owned by Chevron, had a worse catastrophe in the Ecuadorian Amazon. The last I heard, the amount of toxin waste that was spilled in the Amazon by Texaco were roughly 3 times more than what's gone into the Gulf so far. That changes every day, so I'm not sure what the number is today. But and that was intentional. Texaco did this as a matter of policy. It wasn't an accident. And the largest environmental lawsuit in the history of the world now is filed against Mexico on behalf of 30,000.
How did they do it on purpose, John? I mean, can you explain that? Why would they do that on purpose?
Well, it's deep in the Amazon, and when drillers drill for oil, they have a lot of oil that comes up that they never use, that they flare off, that they spill off, and under most regulations, they have to take care of that. Somehow they have to manage it. But in those days, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, they got away without managing it all. They just dumped it into huge pools, so now you've got huge lakes out there. I've seen these that are just toxic waste, oil and other toxic waste from oil producing. And at the time, Ecuador was run by dictators, a military dictatorship that was put into power by the CIA and allowed Texaco to get away with this. It was not a democratically elected government. It was a U.S. puppet government. I was there. It was in the late 60s and the 70s. I was there first as a Peace Corps volunteer and then as an economic hitman at the time. And the current president of Ecuador is extremely incensed over this, and there's no question. Exxon and Texaco, needs to pay up. The fact of the matter is, people are still dying because Texaco is hardballing this and refusing to settle this case and refusing to take responsibility. And it's Texaco, but as I said before, it's now owned by Chevron, so it's really Chevron these days. It's a terrible catastrophe. And the executives of Chevron are doing nothing today to resolve this problem. And yet we don't even hear about that in the United States. And that's part of my point, Hillary, is that these things go on all the time in Africa, in Indonesia, in Latin America, all over the world that we don't even pay attention to. We just say, okay, what the heck? Just keep pumping oil and give it to me cheap. So I hate to say this, and I want to be very careful that I don't get misunderstood. If there has to be such a terrible oil spill, I'm sorry there is, but if it has to be, I think the world is blessed that it happened off the shores of the United States, because we are the largest consumer of oil in the world. We're the most powerful and wealthiest nation in the world. And now we're understanding the implications of things that have been happening on many different scales throughout the rest of the world, the third world, for years and years and years, and we haven't even noticed.
It's just really sad. It's a really devastating event, but it's also, to find a positive in it, it's going to wake up people, don't you think? Don't you think that most people would look at this situation now and say, we have a problem, or want to act on it somehow?
Yes, I think that should be a very strong positive benefit that comes out of this. My fear, Hillary, is that the oil companies and many other powerful interests, many politicians will tell us that all we need to do is ban offshore drilling in the United States. And that would be a terrible mistake, because if we don't cut back demand for oil, that means we'll just take the same disaster someplace else. We'll go back deep into the Amazon. We'll go into the deserts of the Middle East. We'll go into the jungles of Indonesia. And that's not a solution. So we have to be very careful, I think, that we don't just say, well, the solution is no more offshore drilling in the Gulf or any place in the United States. We have to truly understand this as being a message that there's a virus creeping around the world. I call it the mutant viral form of predatory capitalism. Mm-hmm. And very much symbolized by this oil spill that's spreading throughout the Gulf and could spread throughout the oceans of the world. There is this spreading viral capitalism that is very, very destructive and is a failed system, really, and is a system that's, in essence, threatening to truly destroy our planet, whether it comes from this oil well or something else. You know, we had the disaster in Bhopal in India back a number of years ago. We've had many of these sorts of things around the world. It's time we really woke up and said, you know, we've got to change our consciousness. We've got to take as our first priority creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world for every child on this planet.
Now, how do we do that, John? Because since these companies have become so gigantic and they have so much power and so much influence in the current system, how does an ordinary, average person like myself change anything?
Well, I think, Hillary, we have a lot more power than we realize. And my most recent book, Hoodwinked, is devoted to that addressing that. What can we do? What can you do? What can all of your listeners do? And I obviously can't cover a whole book in this radio program, so I suggest people read the book if they're really interested. But to summarize it, you know, there's 5 different areas, and perhaps the most important one is that we as consumers have a great deal of power. These big corporations exist only because we support them one way or another. We buy their goods and services, or our tax dollars do. Now, this is a global empire, but it's the first one in history that hasn't been created by the military. Nobody is forced to buy from Nike or from Exxon or from BP. Nobody is forced to buy any of these things. And if we recognize that the marketplace is democratic, and that every time we buy something or choose not to, we're casting a vote. And if we express our opinions to these buyers, let me give you an example. If every one of your listeners, when we get off this program, goes to their computer and sends an email to Nike and says, I'm not buying any more Nike products because I know you still have sweatshops and slave labor in Indonesia. I'm not going to buy any of your products until you pay those people fair wages and give them decent working conditions. I'm not asking you to get out of Indonesia and turn those people out of jobs. I'm asking you to give them fair wages and decent living conditions and health insurance. If we all did this, Nike would have to come around. We have that power. We got rid of apartheid in South Africa by boycotting businesses that supported it. We got companies to clean up terribly polluted rivers all over the United States back in the 70s. More recently, we've got them to get rid of trans fats in foods and very recently antibiotics in chickens. But now we need to ratchet this up a notch and say, we're not going to buy from any company that is not committed to creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. That's got to be the commitment. They don't have to be perfect at it, but that has to be their commitment. I'm only going to buy from companies like that, and I have made that commitment. We can do that and send them emails. Let them know, because they do read those, or somebody reads them. The CEO doesn't read the emails, but he does get a matrix once a week or so that tells them what kind of emails are coming in, and it matters. It's important to them.
We're going to go to the phone lines. We have a caller on the line from Alberta, Canada. Jay, thanks for calling in. You have a question?
Yes, I do, Hillary. Thanks so much. Hey, John, I just wondered regarding the oil in the Gulf. When this thing is, they can't cap this, and all these gallons and barrels of oil are going to be actually leaking out of there. I just wonder if it's going to shock the oil futures market, because in order to, like, the Saudis need like $55 a barrel over above what's going on right now in order to keep their country sustainable. and going. And if they find out, well, if the futures find out that there's more oil than they're creating a shortage for, and it goes down, then it's going to affect the Saudis, plus our economy in Alberta too, which is based on oil. And just wonder what it's going to do to the American economy too. I just find that there's more and more stuff that oil is going to do, even the environmental effects of Florida and the Panhandle there. It's going to devastate them, even the economic, the fruit and vegetable market, and also the tourism market. So I just wonder what your views on that.
Well, certainly, yes. We don't know the full impact at this point. And I was involved in a discussion a few days ago on that point. We were talking about peak oil and this whole idea that, there's a limited supply. And in a way, people were saying on this panel that this endless well is showing us that there is no limit to the supply of oil. There's a lot of oil down there gushing away, and that's one thing that may be coming out of this. And certainly BP stocks have fluctuated a lot since this has happened. And the credibility of the industry is being challenged, but I think we also have to remember that it's an incredibly powerful industry. There's so much of the world economy depends on oil one way or another that it's always been a very resilient industry. But I think, we the people must speak out, and we must say, one of the things we must say is we've got to get off oil. There's no question. It's a terrible substance to be dealing with. And when we sometimes talk about the limited supply, possibility of a very limited supply of oil, the peak oil idea, to me what's perhaps more of a concern than we will run out of oil or not. I wish we would run out of oil in a way, but the bigger concern is can the carrying system of the planet handle this much carbon dioxide? And I think that's a more limiting factor than the amount of oil that we have, whether we can handle the greenhouse effect that comes out of this. So hopefully this terrible catastrophe that's going on in the Gulf, combined with what's going on in Ecuador and other places, will shake us awake to realize that we have got to get off the oil economy. We simply have to get off. It's a terrible, terrible addiction. And like any addiction, the only way to get rid of it is essentially to go cold turkey.
Mm. Well, I have another question. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, Jay. Go ahead. We have time.
Yeah, I just wonder what, we have in the world, we have an economic pyramid. That means that it's all interconnected in some way. So if we take out one way of doing things, it's still there. And I'm wondering is that we have no, like when you buy a product, okay, let's say it's, let's say you buy something that has a plastic wrapping and stuff like that. There's no way of actually really doing something useful with that plastic. You can do something with cardboard, but not really with plastic because it's made of petroleum. And there's no how would you say it, reusable resource or, turning that into a reusable product again and turn it around again and close the loop. So we really have no way of going back to a way of, making a closed loop system. It's just a one-way system.
Well, that's exactly why we have to get off oil. I mean, what's done is done. We can't go back and get rid of all the plastics and all the other oil residues that are around the planet, but we can stop creating more, and we need to do that. We really need to make a commitment. Like I said, it's an addiction that we have to go cold turkey on.
Thanks, Jay. Great questions. Thanks for calling in tonight. We have another question through the InQuick system from John in Vancouver. John asks, is there any governance of the common property of the planet? Tribes in Pakistan took a stand against Coca-Cola and Pepsi over water for beverage contracts made by the government. How can citizens of the world take similar actions?
Well, we're seeing a lot going on, and incidentally, in Vancouver, I'm speaking and doing a workshop in Vancouver in late July at the Tipping Point Conference. It's 22nd to the 28th of July. I'd love to meet the listener there and other people. You're getting callers from all over, Hillary. This is wonderful. But go to my website, johnperkins.org, and you can find out where I'm going to be. I'd love to meet some of your listeners. I travel around speaking a lot. Yeah, this whole thing of international governance, we don't have any. And the UN has proven to be a paper tiger. You know, it stood up hard against the Iraqi war to begin with, but totally capitulated. The World Bank is in the pocket of the economic hitmen and the corporatocracy. We need a world governing organization to watch out for these things. We don't have it, and the big corporations will resist it. They'll fight it. So I would really encourage the listener who wrote in about this to go out there and fight for it. You know, the Internet gives you a tremendous forum today. We need to push for these things. It's got to come from we, the people, around the planet. We have to take back our planet. I feel that the United States, our country, has been stolen, and Canada also has been stolen. The world has been stolen by these robber barons, modern-day robber barons. We must take it back. And we, the people, are going to have to do this. But just as we had to do everything in the past, we're the ones who had to get rid of apartheid. We're the ones who had to shout out against racial biases and biases against gender in the United States, in Canada, around the world. We must do it now. We really need to take back our country. And there is no international body, really, that supervises these things. We're it. And how we shop does matter. So go after those international companies, arrange boycotts, letter-writing campaigns, email-writing campaigns. Those are so easy. And we must go after these people. We have to do it.
Let me ask you a question about Monsanto. Now, that kind of corporation is almost just so gigantic, and it has its hands in everything, and it's taking over the food systems with patented seeds and, you know, doing all kinds of things, strange genetically modified, you know, experiments on different, you know, food sources and stuff. And there's legislations that's passing pretty much for the most part that these things don't have to be labeled so that we can't make those decisions. How would we combat something like that if we speak up and the politicians still don't make those decisions where that's supposed to happen, and then we consume things that we don't want? How do we take a stand to something like that?
Well, you boycott everything that Monsanto produces, everything that they produce. You know, and Whole Foods, for example, won't sell you any products that have GMOs in it. I think that's wonderful. I know a lot of people have problems with Whole Foods and some of their labor policies. I have problems with those too, but one thing they are doing right is staying away from GMOs, and you can be sure, as I understand it, when you buy things there, and many other stores. And let Monsanto know. Send them emails, and let the stores that you buy from that don't use GMOs know. Europe has had a huge, fantastic success record. You don't get things with GMOs in Europe. So you can buy something made by Kellogg's in the United States that has GMOs in it. In Europe, that same product doesn't. So they've been able to make this happen in Europe. We can make it happen here too, but we have to have the resolve. You know, we the people have to, you know, get off our fannies, stop looking at television for long enough to get on the computer and make it happen. And God, it's so easy today. You know, if you go to my website, johnperkins.org, there's a whole link there for signing petitions, and there's hundreds of petitions, and you can sign one of them. It's very, very easy. All you got to do is click on it and put your name and address in, and then once you're done, it'll continue to stay in. All you have to do is go back when new petitions come up. They are important. We've got a great media here now for casting votes constantly, but we all need to take an active role in this.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of media, John, President Obama just issued a media blackout for the Gulf of Mexico, where people can be fined up to $40,000 for getting closer than 65 feet to the boons or to anything related, the ships. What do you have to say about that kind of action taken by our government when there should be transparency? Do you think that is a result of BP demanding that happens?
Absolutely. It shows you the power that BP has, that the oil industry in general has. They're all stepping up behind BP now. You know, if good journalists should get out there and defy those orders and be taken to jail if necessary. Imagine, Walter Cronkite, who came back from Vietnam and said, it isn't like it looks over there. We're losing that war and we shouldn't be there. Had a huge impact. I think if Walter Cronkite were 40 years old today, he'd probably be down there with a CBS crew breaking the law. And we need to have that happen. It's terrible, and it's also terrible in the United States. The ban on showing caskets and bodies coming back from Afghanistan or Iraq. The media should not stand for these things. It's a sign that our mainstream media is totally sold out. They're either owned by the corporatocracy directly or through advertising budgets. But thank God there's programs like this one, Hillary. Yeah. We do have a free press, and it's coming in through programs like this, through streaming, through the internet, through blogging. There's an amazing thing going on out there. And most of the bloggers and streamers and people doing these kinds of programs like yours don't have the finances or the staying power to go and cross these lines and go in and get arrested and probably wouldn't get that much attention. So we need a few bold journalists out there that are in the limelight, the Walter Cronkite types that'll do this. And I'm just hoping one will emerge. But it's disgusting. It's disgusting that the Obama administration would yield to something like this. But the fact is, our presidents are not very powerful anymore, and they're very vulnerable.
Yeah, I see a lot of anger towards Obama, and I try to stress to people that it's not necessarily him making these decisions. It's a product of a system. Speaking of Afghanistan, John, I recently found out that they have discovered, how unusually now they've discovered this $14 trillion mineral resource deposit that's in Afghanistan. Now, from your background, would the war in Afghanistan minus 9/11 would that have been a reason to go into that country to try to take over what was going on there?
Certainly, and that's one of the reasons we did go in. This may be news to most of us, these mineral deposits, but it's not news to the corporatocracy. They've known all along. They may not have known the value of it. They still don't know the value of it. They're throwing numbers around now, but they've known it was there for a long time. And they've known Afghanistan is in a critical strategic location geographically. The Soviets knew that. That's why they basically Afghanistan brought down the Soviet Union, but the Soviets were determined to win in Afghanistan. That's why they stayed in so long, because they knew about these minerals and they knew about the strategic location. The other thing I think it's important for us to understand, Hillary, is that our economy is very, very based on war. It's based on oil and war, and the two go together. And there's a movie out that Oliver Stone just released called South of the Border, I think is the name of it. I saw excerpts of it before it was released. It's about some of the major presidents in South America. And he interviews President Kirchner, the former president of Argentina, who talks about a meeting he had with the second George Bush president, in which Bush said, the economy of the United States is based on war. We have to keep going to war. And that's true at this point. But you and I and all your listeners, we the people have to turn this around too. We have to look for a new kind of economy. I write extensively about that in Hoodwinked, how we've got to come up with an economy that serves the world rather than serves the war machines. And let's get all those brilliant minds today who work for General Dynamics and General Motors and General Electric, all the other generals, Raytheon and all the military industries who are supported by our tax dollars. Let's insist that our tax dollars pay them to, instead of making missiles and anti-aircraft and so on and so forth, to come up with technologies that will clean up the terribly polluted lands of the world. We've polluted the world. We've polluted the earth. We've polluted the water. We've polluted the air all over. Let's devote ourselves to coming up with technologies to clean it up. Let's devote ourselves. Let's pay Cargill and Kraft and Chiquita and all the other agribusinesses, Monsanto, that are doing so much damage, to instead come up with ways for the starving people of Africa to produce food more efficiently, to store it on a local level and distribute it locally in efficient ways so that they no longer have to starve. We talk about sustainable energy, and that's very important, but there's so many other things we can do, too, to create a new economy. And I go into detail in Hoodwinked about how each of us should be participating in that on one level or another. Mm-hmm. Get out of the military economy. Get into a new economy that's earth-friendly.
John, do you think 9/11 was an inside job? Do you think it was something that happened so that we could use it as an excuse to go into Afghanistan, to go to war?
You're blunt, aren't you?
Yeah. But we only have 18 minutes left, so.
you know, Hillary, I have to say I don't like to talk about things I don't have personal experience, and I have no inside information on 9/11. But what I will say is, I cannot believe that a man with a walkie-talkie standing in the cave in the Himalayas directed that operation. Nor can I understand why there's a huge hole put in the nation's largest fortress, most important fortress, Pentagon. The hole was put there, and no senior official lost their job. No general lost his job. That's amazing. And there's cameras all over the Pentagon. Why has nobody ever produced that photograph of that plane hitting the Pentagon? It's incredibly suspicious. I don't know who did it, but I don't believe the official story.
So now that we have this open-ended kind of threat of terrorism going on in the world, do you think that has given the corporatocracy, the American empire, a green card to go into whatever country they want? For example, what's going on with Iran right now. Is this an example of how economic hitman would work? Because it seems to me there was a lot of negotiation going on trying to get them to, do certain things, and now all of a sudden it's escalating, and it feels kind of like what you describe in your books. Is that indeed what's going on?
It is. It's a huge deception. There is no such thing as terrorism. There are people performing acts of terror around the world, but there's no global terrorism. I know members of Al-Qaeda. I've interviewed them. I've interviewed members of FARC in Colombia. I've interviewed Somali pirates. They have nothing in common. It's not a global movement. This is not like communism. It's not like Catholicism. It's not like Protestantism. There's a lot of isms, but terrorism is not an ism. There are acts of terror, yes, but they are not united in this. There's no such thing as a war on terror. And we bought into that somehow. The media has been extremely reluctant to really face the facts. The corporatocracy wants to convince us that this is another war. It's like the war on communism. But the war on terrorism is not the same thing at all. We simply bought into it, and we bought into the fear around it. Most of the terrorists that I've interviewed, in fact, I'd say all the ones that I've interviewed, are desperate people. They're starving. The Somali pirates, fishermen whose fishing waters were destroyed by piracy from European and other foreign fishing vessels, and also U.S. Navy vessels dumping nuclear waste from Diego Garcia Island, where their big base is there, into fishermen's waters. For 20 years, those fishermen complained to the UN and other international bodies about the pirating of their seas. They can no longer fish. Their kids are starving. They turn to piracy. Every terrorist I've ever interviewed says, I don't want to be a terrorist. It's a dangerous occupation. I just want to be able to provide a living for my kids. Now, I'm not saying there aren't fanatics. There are. There's a lot of fanatics. There are people that are wealthy that are involved in acts of terror. But this is not, this war on terrorism is a misnomer. There's no such thing as global terrorism. They're simply acts of terror, and the best way to deal with them, for the most part, is to help the economies in the regions where these people are being bred, because most people don't want to be terrorists. They won't follow the fanatic leaders unless they're desperate.
So do you think that this is being used to manipulate the majority of people to be complacent with the way we have set up our systems?
Yeah, we're buying into it, It's easy for us to believe. We want to believe our country's a good place and that there's bad people out there that are behind all of this, and our economy's collapsing. I don't have a job because there's bad people out there, whatever. It's easy to believe that. It's seductive, and it is a technique of economic hitmen. It's been taken to a very, very large level now. But we, the people, need to stop buying that and understand that, yes, there are bad people that we have to protect ourselves against. There's always going to be, rapists and mass murderers and people with screws loose in their brains. Mm-hmm. But that's not the same as an international movement of terrorism. Movements like that, organizations like Al-Qaeda can only exist on a large level because there are desperate people who are extremely angry about what we're doing in the Middle East and what we're doing in Indonesia with oil and exploitation of resources, and what we're doing in many other places. You can go into Latin America, you can go into barrios, these very, very poor ghettos in Caracas and other places in Latin America, and see pictures of Osama bin Laden as a hero. It's not because these people are Muslims. They're not. They're Catholics. They don't like Islam. But they see Osama bin Laden as a kind of Robin Hood because he's standing up to what they see as a dangerous empire, the United States. And I think that's very sad, Hillary. I think we need to come into the world with a new vision. Like I explained before, develop a new economy that's going to be aimed at helping starving people around the world and cleaning up the impoverished planet. Let's come up with a really good picture that gets rid of terrorism by getting rid of the root causes of it.
John, now how would you tell that to, a young man growing up in the system like you did, going to school, trying to go forward in their career, and then they get tempted and seduced with money, power, and sex like you did, and how do you think they would take that message that you just shared now and compare it to what they're being offered on the table? Is it just a dysfunctional kind of mechanism in the human being itself, or is it just a matter of reaching deeper into people to really get them to understand that concept?
It's a matter of getting the word out, and I think that's been the problem. When I was in college, for example, in high school and college, nobody was talking the way I'm talking today about the system. There was a huge anti-communist movement. There was a big Red Scare. My father and mother were staunch conservative Republicans who were very, very terrified of communism. I grew up with that. Television programs like I Led Three Lives, or a bunch of television programs that scared the pants off of us about communists. We grew up with that, and there was nobody out speaking like what we're talking right now. The Vietnam War came along, and then there was a huge movement against it. I went to Boston University, and Howard Zinn, who just recently deceased, God bless him, a mentor and a very dear friend of mine, he was speaking out, and Noam Chomsky and a number of other liberals against the Vietnam War. But it was at that time, it was all oriented toward that one war, not the bigger issues. And when the war ended, we didn't go and examine the bigger issues. A few people did. Chomsky did. Zinn did, to a certain degree, but not many people were listening. Today, I think more people are listening. And so, I'm doing exactly what I think I have to do, which is I go around and speak at a lot of college campuses, a lot of MBA programs. I speak at business conferences. I want people to get this word, and there's a lot of others out there. There's a lot of good books. There's a lot of good movies that have come out. The Constant Gardener, Blood Diamond, Hotel Rwanda, the Al Gore movie on the environment, many movies that are now opening people's eyes.
Do you think that global warming is part of this kind of buying into, needing to change things and benefit the big companies that are doing that? Or do you think it's a real consequence of what our world has been going through and where we're at now?
Well, global warming is a fact, I think. I've seen the glaciers melting terribly on the Himalayas and in the Andes, and also in the United States and Canada. So it's happening. There's no question that global warming is happening. And whether we humans are causing it or not, I think is who needs to argue that point? I happen to think we are, but so what if we're not? The fact of the matter is something's happening on this planet, and we need to look at this as an opportunity to change things. We need to look at this as an opportunity to conserve energy, to cut back on our oil use, to cut back on all energy use, to cut back on resource exploitation, to really become much more conscious and to realize that life is not about possessing more and more material goods. What makes us happy is not that. What makes us happy is, decent living conditions, being taken care of in our old age, being loved, being taken care of as babies, it's pretty simple. And we need to really focus on those things and look at this possibility or look at the fact of global warming as a wake-up call that we really need to change our relationship to the planet and to ourselves and each other and the way we conduct our lives and run our institutions.
David from Fort Collins writes in, he says, to play devil's advocate for a minute, how does John think we can possibly convince most Americans that 3 SUVs and a 60-inch TV is not their God-given birthright?
Well, I think it's happening, to be honest. I really think people are beginning to get it, and they may not have acted accordingly yet, but it takes a while. Confessions of an Economic Hitman came out in late 2004. I was on an extensive college speaking tour during most of 2005, including a lot of big MBA programs, Wharton, Stanford, the famous MBA programs. Every time I spoke at one of these schools, I arranged to have dinner with anywhere from a dozen to 36 students before I spoke. And I would say to them, let's go around the table. I want to hear from each of you now. Why are you at the school? Why are you having dinner with me? What are your aspirations? Back in 2005, they were all of them talking about money and power. That's what they were there for. That's what they wanted. Well, this last year, I did something very similar. Went on the same basic tour to many of the same colleges in 2009 and then again in the spring of 2010. I didn't hear that at all. I heard a very different story from basically the same, not the same individual students, but the same class of students. And now they're saying that they want to create a better world, that they realize that if they're going to have kids, they've got to create a better world. Many of them said they have big college loans. They're going to have to go to work for corporations to pay off those loans, but that's not why they're in these business schools. They're there because they want to become entrepreneurs and do things that will make a better world. I think things, Hillary, are changing. I think consciousness is changing. And when you consider that's over a period of 5 years, and it may seem like a long time in our lives, sometimes 5 years, but in history, it's not even a blink. So I have hope that things are happening, but we have to keep pushing. People like you, this program, pushing, getting the word out. This is what's so important. We must educate ourselves and each other.
John, now you have an extensive background and experience in shamanic cultures, indigenous cultures that you came across when you were working in these third world countries. How did that affect your ability? Did that play a part in your coming out of this with such a drastically different perspective?
It absolutely did, Hillary. I thank these indigenous cultures and the shamans. I still have a very strong connection. I have 3 godchildren in the Amazon and Andes who are children of shamans, elder teachers there. And one of the things they always teach is that change is possible. Anything's possible. All you got to do is change your dream, change your consciousness. A book I wrote before Confessions of an Economic Hitman was The World is As You Dream, and it's still available. You can get it at bookstores. You can get it at my website, johnperkins.org. But it really addresses that the shamans say, when you have a dream, whether it's an individual or a cultural dream, and you give it energy, it manifests. And we in our culture have given energy to a dream of big material success, lots of cars, big industry, lots of tall buildings. It manifested. And now we're realizing that it's destroying us. It's threatening to destroy us. And so we need to change that dream to a dream, as I outlined before, of living a life that's much more satisfying than a life that's solely based on materialism. So we need to create a new dream. And shamanism has taught me the incredible potential for doing that, and that it can happen very quickly. Another book I wrote is Shape-Shifting, which is about that, how you can change that energy and you can shape-shift an individual or a culture very quickly.
So in shape-shifting, let's say somebody's listening to this program and they work in a corporate world and they have a corporate job and they feel kind of, have a sense of hopelessness in that job. How would they actually shape-shift what in what they were doing, and what are some steps they could do to do that?
Now, I teach a workshop on that at the Omega Institute in upstate New York every summer in August. I'd suggest you come to it. You can go to johnperkins.org, read the book. It's a process that's hard to describe in 5 minutes here, but I think the important thing is to understand that shape-shifting is all about energy. And in fact, everything is energy. That's one reason oil is so important, because it's our main energy source. And everything we do is about energy. Einstein said, matter and energy. That's what it's all about. And so when we give our energy to a certain dream or certain idea, we shapeshift into that. And if we change that idea, that dream, that concept, that paradigm, and we give energy to a new one, and we truly do it, it will manifest. And it's eerie how that happens. And, if you read the thoughts of most of the great people that have made a mark in history, whether it's someone like a George Washington or Martha Washington or someone like a Thomas Edison or Rosa Parks or whoever, Einstein, you'll see that they're all about changing energy, giving new energy giving strong energy to a new intent, a new dream, a new precept. And in the case of Rosa Parks, for example, all she had to do was sit on the front of the bus instead of the back. I say all she had to do. At the time, that took a tremendous amount of courage, a tremendous amount of energy, psychic and emotional as well as physical energy, just to move from the back of the bus to the front. But it changed the world. It absolutely changed the world.
What a beautiful example. I'm talking to John Perkins. You can go to his website to find out more about his upcoming events and his books, johnperkins.org. So, John, you also do trips, I understand, to different sacred sites around the world. How did you get involved into doing that?
Well, I've been doing that since 1991 when the Shwa of the Amazon, I went down there and told them I wanted to help them save their forest, and they said, then you got to change the dream of your people. That's where the book, The World Is As You Dream It, came from. And they said, so, for one thing, you can bring people down here to learn from us about shape-shifting. And I've probably taken 1,000 people into the Amazon over the past 20 years to learn about that. And now, this December, I'm doing a trip with my co-facilitator, Lynn Roberts, to Guatemala, to the Mayans, to really look into the 2012 prophecy, and this tipping point conference in Vancouver, July the 22nd to 28th is on the same thing, the tipping point prophecies, and they're the organizers of the December trip. Lynn and I led a trip of about 25 people last December to the Mayans to work with their shamans, their elders, and explore the true meaning of 2012, and we're doing another one this December. It's a wonderful experience, to be amongst these sacred sites, these huge pyramids, these amazing sites, do fire ceremonies late at night, really get into the shamanic vision and journey to really experience it and work with these extremely powerful shamanic teachers, men and women. I enjoy it immensely, and the people on the trips get a great deal out of it. It's very experiential. It's wonderful.
I love the quote. I'm going to quote you on what you just said. You have to change the dream of your people. And in the last 30, 40 seconds of the show, what is the message in that statement that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think first of all, it's very easy to give up. It's very easy to just throw up your hand and say, the problem's just too big, it's too difficult. But that doesn't accomplish anything. Thank God Rosa Parks didn't say that. Or Rachel Carson didn't say that about DDT. Instead, she sat down and wrote a book. She had no idea whether it'd be published or not. It became a Silent Spring, and it started a worldwide environmental movement. You can look at examples throughout history. We mustn't throw up our hands and give up. Instead, we got to get on the Internet or do whatever any individual's most moved to do. Get out on the streets, demonstrate, call people, have parties, do whatever. But take action, and we have to take action. And when we start to take action and get energy to our new dream, it happens. It does manifest, and we've got to make this one manifest. The new dream has to be about a sustainable, just, and peaceful world for every child on the planet, and we all need to give that as much energy as we possibly can.
John Perkins, everybody. John, thanks so much for joining me on the air. It's been a pleasure. Best of luck with everything you're doing. Everybody, thanks so much for listening. I'm Hillary Raimo, and until next time, live well. Namaste.